I was finally having dinner with my son after 2 years of silence when my phone buzzed. "Get up. Leave now. Don't say anything to your son." My hands trembled as I stared at the message from an unknown number. How could a stranger know I was here? Why would they warn me about my own child? 6 months later, when my son was led away in handcuffs, screaming, "Dad, please don't do this to me," I realized that mysterious text had saved my life. If you've ever wondered who you can really trust when everyone else has given up on you, you need to hear this story. "Dad? Dad, are you there?" Ethan's voice poured through the speaker, warm and rich as good coffee, with that familiar laugh hiding just underneath the words. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, drinking in every syllable like a man who'd been thirsty for years. "I'm here, son," I managed, my voice catching slightly on the word son, a word I'd whispered to empty rooms more times than I cared to count. The kitchen suddenly felt brighter, as if someone had turned up all the lights, and I found myself grinning at my own reflection in the window. Laura's geraniums on the sill seemed to lean toward me, as if they were listening too, as if they knew this moment mattered. "Listen, Dad. I know it's been too long since we talked." His voice carried that earnest quality I remembered from his childhood, when he'd come to me with scraped knees or broken toys, trusting that I could fix anything. My chest swelled with a warmth I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. "Sophie's making roast beef tonight, the way Mom used to make it, with those little red potatoes you always said were better than candy." I laughed out loud at that, remembering Sunday dinners when he was 12, sneaking extra potatoes when he thought no one was looking. The sound of my own laughter surprised me. When was the last time this house had heard it? "We want you to come over, Dad, for dinner, just family." I set the cup down gently in the dish rack, my hands steady now, energized. Family dinner. Real conversation across a real table, not the hollow echo of my own voice talking to Laura's photograph. "What time should I be there?" I asked, already mentally going through my closet, wondering if my good suit still fit, if I had a decent bottle of wine tucked away somewhere. The relief in Ethan's voice was like music. 7:30 would be perfect. I'll text you the address. We moved last year, got a place in Montclair. Nothing too fancy, but Sophie's really excited to cook for you." Nothing too fancy. I had to smile at that. My son had always been modest, even when he'd been promoted to senior analyst, even when he'd married that lovely girl who made him so happy. "And Dad?" Ethan's voice softened, became almost shy. "This means a lot to us. To me. I've missed talking to you." My throat tightened with emotion I hadn't expected, the kind that comes when you realize how much you've been holding back, how much love you've been storing up with nowhere to spend it. "I've missed you too, son. More than you know." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, heavy with all the conversations we were going to have, all the lost time we could start to reclaim. "I'll be there," I promised, and meant it with every fiber of my being. After he hung up, I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, watching the last of the sunlight paint everything gold. The house felt different already, charged with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were preparing for me to come home with stories, with laughter, with the kind of fullness that had been missing for too long. I was going to see my son. We were going to be a family again. I walked to my bedroom closet with a spring in my step I hadn't felt in years, humming that old tune Laura used to sing while she cooked. The navy suit hung there, waiting, the one I'd worn to Ethan's wedding, the one that made Laura say I looked distinguished as a senator. I pulled it from its hanger and held it up to the light, checking for wrinkles, for any signs of the moth damage I'd been dreading. Perfect. The wool still felt rich under my fingers, still held its shape, still carried just the faintest trace of Laura's perfume, from when she'd straightened my lapels that wedding day. "You clean up nice, Frank Miller," I said aloud, hearing her voice in my own words, feeling her approval like sunshine on my face. In the bathroom mirror, I knotted my burgundy tie, the silk one Laura had given me for our 35th anniversary, the one she'd said brought out my eyes. My reflection looked different somehow. Younger, more alive. The gray hair didn't seem so stark. The lines around my eyes looked more like smile lines than worry lines, and my shoulders sat straighter, ready to carry good news instead of grief. I splashed aftershave on my cheeks, the bay rum scent filling the small bathroom with memories of Saturday nights when we'd go dancing, when Laura would rest her head on my shoulder and tell me I smelled like adventure. Tonight felt like adventure. Tonight felt like coming back to life. Back in the kitchen, I climbed on the step stool to reach the cabinet above the refrigerator, my fingers searching until they found it, the bottle of 1995 Bordeaux I'd been saving, the same vintage we'd served at Ethan's wedding reception, the one the sommelier had called exceptional for the year. I'd bought a whole case then, planning to open one bottle every anniversary with my son and daughter-in-law, creating a tradition that would last decades. The label was still pristine, the foil unbroken, the bottle heavy with promise in my hands. This would be perfect, a gesture that said, "New beginnings," and "I believe in us," all at once. Before leaving, I went to the nightstand and picked up Laura's pocket watch, the gold timepiece her father had given her when she graduated high school. She'd carried it everywhere, wound it every morning like a prayer, claimed it kept more accurate time than any digital device. I wound it now, listening to its gentle ticking, steady and reassuring as a heartbeat, as reliable as love itself. The watch slipped into my vest pocket, warm against my chest, and I felt like I was carrying her blessing with me, her excitement for this reunion she'd always hoped to see. "Don't be late," I whispered, hearing her voice in the familiar phrase. "This might be the chance we've been waiting for." I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, paused to check my reflection one more time in the hallway mirror, and smiled at what I saw. A father going to dinner with his son, a man with somewhere to be, someone to see, stories to share, and love to give. The evening stretched ahead of me, full of possibility, full of the kind of joy I'd almost forgotten I was capable of feeling. The GPS voice announced my arrival just as I turned onto Elm Ridge Drive, and my breath caught in my throat. Towering oak trees lined the street like sentries, their branches forming a canopy over pavement so smooth it looked freshly poured. Each house sat back from the road like a jewel in its setting, surrounded by manicured lawns that belonged in magazines. I drove slowly, checking house numbers, my old Honda feeling suddenly modest among the luxury sedans and gleaming SUVs parked in circular driveways. When I reached 847, I had to pull over and stare. The mansion rose before me like something from a fairy tale, all white columns and soaring windows, with warm light spilling from every pane onto the perfectly sculpted gardens below. A BMW sat in the circular drive next to a Mercedes, both cars newer than anything I'd ever owned, their chrome bumpers reflecting the house's grandeur like mirrors. I sat in my car for a full minute, the Bordeaux growing warm in my lap, trying to process what I was seeing. The boy who'd grown up sharing a bedroom with his younger cousin during family visits, who'd worked summers at the hardware store to pay for college textbooks, lived here. My chest swelled with pride so intense it almost hurt. I walked up the stone pathway, my dress shoes clicking against flagstones that must have cost more than my monthly pension. The front door was solid mahogany with brass fixtures that gleamed like gold, and through the tall windows on either side, I caught glimpses of crystal chandeliers and oil paintings in ornate frames. A doorbell chimed somewhere deep inside the house when I pressed it, the sound echoing like church bells. My heart hammered against my ribs. But it was the good kind of nervous, the kind you feel before opening a present you know will be perfect. The door swung open, and Sophie stood there in a dress the color of fresh blood, silk that seemed to move like liquid in the light. She looked exactly as I remembered from the wedding photos, maybe even more polished somehow. Her dark hair swept up in a way that showed off diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement. "Frank!" she exclaimed, her voice bright as champagne bubbles. "Oh my goodness, look at you in that handsome suit!" She stepped forward and kissed my cheek, her perfume enveloping me in notes of jasmine and something exotic I couldn't name. Her hands felt cool against my arms as she drew me inside, and I noticed how her nails were perfectly manicured, painted the same shade as her dress. The foyer opened up around me like a cathedral, with marble floors that reflected everything twice, and a staircase that curved upward like something from a movie. A chandelier the size of my kitchen table hung overhead, casting rainbow patterns on the walls through hundreds of crystal teardrops. Sophie took my coat and the wine bottle, her fingers brushing mine as she accepted the Bordeaux. "Oh, Frank, you shouldn't have, but this looks absolutely lovely," she said, reading the label with what looked like genuine appreciation. The bottle seemed to shrink in her hands, and I wondered if she was used to wines far more expensive than anything I could afford. "Ethan's just finishing up a call in his office," she continued, leading me through rooms that flowed into each other like pages in an expensive magazine. Every surface gleamed, every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, and the artwork on the walls made my eyes widen with wonder. "He's so excited you're here, Frank. We both are. It's been far too long." She turned to smile at me over her shoulder, and for just an instant, something flickered across her face too quickly for me to read. Then it was gone, replaced by that bright hospitality that made me feel welcomed and special. Sophie led me into a living room that took my breath away, with cream-colored leather sofas arranged around a fireplace big enough to roast a whole pig. Persian rugs covered the hardwood floors in rich blues and golds, and floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto gardens that glowed under carefully placed spotlights. "Dad!" Ethan's voice boomed from the doorway, and I turned to see my son striding toward me with arms outstretched. He looked magnificent in a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been made by angels, his hair styled perfectly, his smile bright enough to power the whole house. When he pulled me into a hug, I smelled expensive cologne and success, felt the solid strength of his shoulders, the confidence in his embrace. "God, it's good to see you," he said against my ear, and his voice carried all the warmth I'd been missing for 2 long years. I hugged him back with everything I had, this successful, handsome man who was my son, my pride and joy. "Look at you," I said when we separated, holding him at arm's length to take him all in. "You look like $1,000,000, son." He laughed, that same laugh that had filled our small house in Queens when he was a boy, but richer now, more confident. "Well, maybe not quite 1,000,000, he said with a wink. "But we're doing all right." Sophie appeared beside him, slipping her arm through his in a gesture so natural, it made my heart warm. They looked perfect together, like they'd stepped out of a magazine about successful couples, and I felt a surge of happiness so strong it made my eyes water. "Come on, let's eat," Ethan said, leading me toward what I assumed was the dining room. "Sophie's been cooking all day, and she's nervous about impressing you." Sophie swatted his arm playfully. "I am not nervous," she protested, but her laugh had a musical quality that made everything feel lighter. "I just want everything to be perfect for Frank's first visit to our home." The dining room opened up before us, dominated by a table that could have seated 12, set with china so delicate it looked like it might dissolve if you breathed on it too hard. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with oil paintings of landscapes I wanted to study for hours. The roast beef sat in the center of the table like a crown jewel, surrounded by those little red potatoes Laura used to make, green beans that looked like they'd been arranged by an artist, and rolls that were still steaming from the oven. Sophie had recreated my wife's recipe perfectly, down to the rosemary sprigs tucked around the meat. My throat tightened with emotion, and I had to blink back tears. "Sophie, you've outdone yourself." She beamed at the compliment, but as she turned to serve the potatoes, I caught her exchanging a glance with Ethan. Just a quick look, there and gone in an instant, but something in it made me pause with my fork halfway to my mouth. It was the kind of look married couples share when they're thinking the same thing, when they have a secret. But then Sophie was asking about my garden, and Ethan was telling a funny story about his boss, and the moment passed like smoke in the wind. I raised my wine glass, watching the candlelight dance through the deep red liquid, preparing to toast this perfect evening with my perfect son in his perfect home. The crystal felt cool and substantial against my palm, and I could smell the wine's rich bouquet mixing with the aroma of Sophie's roast beef. Ethan lifted his own glass across from me, his smile wide and genuine, his eyes bright with what looked like pure happiness. "To family," he said, his voice warm with emotion. "To coming home." My chest swelled with such overwhelming joy that I almost couldn't speak. This was everything I'd dreamed of during those long, silent months. My son, successful and thriving, welcoming me back into his life. Just as the rim of the glass touched my lips, my phone buzzed against my chest like an angry wasp trapped in my vest pocket. The vibration was sharp and insistent, cutting through the warm haze of wine and candlelight. I paused with the glass still touching my mouth, feeling the cool crystal against my skin, tasting just the faintest hint of the Bordeaux on my tongue. The buzzing continued, 3 short pulses, then silence. A text message. I glanced up at Ethan and Sophie, both watching me expectantly, their own glasses raised in perfect synchronization. "Sorry," I murmured, feeling heat creep up my neck. "Let me just check this quickly." My hand trembled slightly as I pulled the phone from my pocket, the screen's blue glow seeming harsh after the warm candlelight. The message was from an unknown number, just digits I didn't recognize, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "Stand up. Leave now. Don't tell your son." I stared at the screen, reading the words again, my brain struggling to process them. The letters seemed to swim in front of my eyes, rearranging themselves into different meanings, none of which made any sense. Who would send this? Why? My mouth went dry, and I realized I was still holding my wine glass in my other hand, the liquid sloshing gently as my fingers began to shake. "Dad?" Ethan's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he was sitting right across from me. "Everything all right?" I looked up to find both my son and daughter-in-law staring at me, their expressions shifting from expectation to concern. Sophie's perfectly manicured fingers were wrapped around her wine stem, but she hadn't taken a sip yet. Ethan's brow was furrowed, his head tilted slightly to one side in that gesture I remembered from his childhood, when he was trying to figure out a puzzle. I forced my lips into what I hoped was a reassuring smile, the muscles in my face feeling stiff and unnatural. "Just someone trying to sell me something," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, but I could feel it there against my chest like a burning coal. "You know how persistent telemarketers can be." Sophie laughed, a bright sound that seemed to fill the dining room. "Oh, don't they just have the worst timing?" she said, raising her glass again. "Here we are, trying to have a lovely family dinner, and they're interrupting with their nonsense." Ethan nodded agreement, but his eyes stayed on my face, searching, reading. He'd always been perceptive, even as a child, able to sense when something was wrong before anyone else noticed. I lifted my glass again, trying to recapture the moment, trying to push the strange message out of my mind. But my hand was shaking now, tiny tremors that made the wine shimmer in its crystal bowl. "To family," I echoed, bringing the glass toward my lips once more. The liquid was dark red, almost black in the candlelight, and as I tilted the glass, I caught Sophie watching me over the rim of her own glass. Her smile was perfect, but there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite read. The wine touched my lips again, cool and slightly bitter, and I was just about to take that first sip when my phone buzzed again. Another message. Another unknown number. Another interruption to this perfect evening that suddenly didn't feel quite as perfect as it had moments before. I set my wine glass down with more force than I intended, the crystal making a sharp chime against the china plate beneath it. "I'm so sorry," I said, pushing my chair back from the table. "I should probably turn this off. Let me just step into the hallway for a moment." Sophie's laugh tinkled like wind chimes, but when I glanced at her face, the sound didn't quite match her expression. "Of course, Frank. Take your time," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "We'll keep your dinner warm." Ethan half rose from his seat, as if to follow me, but I waved him back down. "Just give me 1 second, son. I'll be right back." The hallway felt cooler than the dining room, the marble floor clicking under my dress shoes as I walked toward the powder room. My reflection caught in a gilt-framed mirror, and I barely recognized the man staring back, pale, confused, clutching his phone like a lifeline. I pulled up the new message, my thumb hovering over the screen for several seconds before I found the courage to read it. The words appeared in stark black text against the white background. "The drink is not safe. Don't sign anything." My blood turned to ice water in my veins, and I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. The drink is not safe. I stared at the words until they burned into my retinas, my mind racing through possibilities that all seemed impossible. My wine? The wine I'd almost just consumed, the wine that was still sitting on that beautiful table beside my dinner plate. My hands began to shake so violently I nearly dropped the phone. Who was sending these messages? How did they know I was here? Know what I was drinking? The questions multiplied in my head like viruses, each one spawning 3 more, until I felt dizzy with the impossibility of it all. I splashed cold water on my face in the powder room, watching the drops fall from my chin into the marble sink. The face in the mirror looked older than it had just minutes before, the lines around my eyes deeper, the color drained from my cheeks. When I returned to the dining room, every detail seemed suddenly sharp and suspicious. The way the candlelight cast shadows on the walls, the way Sophie's smile seemed painted on, the way Ethan's fingers drummed against the tablecloth in a rhythm that sounded like nervous energy. I slid back into my chair and reached for my wine glass, then stopped. In the bottom of the crystal bowl, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a faint residue. Tiny particles that caught the candlelight like glitter, swirling gently in the dark liquid. My stomach clenched, and I pushed the glass away from me, trying to make the gesture look casual, like I was simply making room for my dinner plate. But my hand shook, betraying me, and the glass made a small scraping sound against the table. "Everything okay, Dad?" Ethan's voice was carefully neutral, but his fingers were tapping against the white tablecloth now, a rapid staccato rhythm that seemed to fill the silence. His smile looked stretched, like plastic pulled too tight. And when I met his eyes, I saw something there that made my chest constrict. Something that looked almost like disappointment? You seem a little distracted tonight. Sophie leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the light as she tilted her head. We were so looking forward to this evening, Frank. I hope those calls weren't anything serious. No, I managed, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Nothing serious at all. But even as I said the words, my phone buzzed again in my pocket. A third message. A third warning from someone who seemed to know exactly what was happening in this beautiful dining room. Someone who was trying to protect me from dangers I couldn't even begin to understand. The weight of the phone against my chest felt like an anchor, dragging me down into a reality I wasn't prepared to face. Somewhere in this perfect house, with my perfect son and his perfect wife, something was very, very wrong. I pushed the roast beef around my plate, trying to look interested in eating, while my stomach churned like a washing machine. The meat tasted like cardboard in my mouth, and every bite required conscious effort to chew and swallow. Ethan was telling a story about his latest business deal, his voice animated and confident, but I found myself studying his face instead of listening to his words. The candlelight caught the planes of his cheekbones, the same strong jawline he'd inherited from his mother, but there was something in his expression that reminded me of a salesman closing a deal. Sophie nodded along, making appropriate sounds of admiration, her red silk dress shimmering with each movement. You know, Dad, Ethan said suddenly, setting down his fork with a deliberate clink against the china. Sophie and I have been talking, and we've been thinking about the future. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin in a gesture that looked rehearsed. The air in the room seemed to shift, becoming thicker, more charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Sophie reached over and placed her hand on Ethan's arm, her diamond wedding ring catching the light like a spotlight. We worry about you, Frank, she said, her voice soft and concerned. Living alone in that big house, handling all those financial responsibilities by yourself. My fork clattered against my plate louder than I intended, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. I managed just fine, I said, but my voice came out rougher than I'd planned. Ethan held up a hand, his smile patient and understanding, the kind of expression you'd use with a confused elderly relative. Of course you do, Dad. Of course. But wouldn't it make sense to put everything under one name? You know, consolidate things? Make it easier for everyone? The words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt something cold crawl up my spine. Under one name. His name, presumably. My house, my savings, my life's work, all signed over with a simple signature. Sophie leaned forward, her perfume wafting across the table like a sweet trap. It would be so much simpler, Frank. No more worrying about property taxes or maintenance or any of those tedious details. Her smile was radiant, but her eyes held a calculating gleam that made my chest tighten. We'd take care of everything. You could just relax, enjoy your retirement without all that stress. Ethan nodded enthusiastically, reaching across the table to pat my hand. His palm felt cold against my skin, and I noticed his fingers were slightly damp with perspiration. Think about it, Dad. No more bills, no more repairs, no more late-night worries about whether you remembered to pay the insurance. The room seemed to be closing in around me, the beautiful chandelier above suddenly feeling oppressive rather than elegant. My phone buzzed against my chest again, and I jumped slightly, the movement making my wine glass wobble precariously. I appreciate the concern, I managed, pulling my hand away from Ethan's touch. But I'm not ready to think about that kind of thing yet. Sophie's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. Oh, but Frank, it's just paperwork. Nothing dramatic or permanent. Just a simple power of attorney arrangement. You'd still live in your house, still make your own decisions. We'd just handle the administrative side of things. Ethan pulled a manila folder from somewhere behind his chair, placing it on the table between the salt and pepper shakers like an offering on an altar. The folder was thick, official-looking, with little yellow sticky notes marking various pages. "I had my lawyer draw up some preliminary documents," he said, his tone casual, as if we were discussing weekend plans rather than signing away my independence. "Just to get the ball rolling. No pressure, of course, but if you wanted to take a look." He opened the folder, revealing dense paragraphs of legal text that swam before my eyes in the candlelight. My mouth went completely dry, and I reached automatically for my wine glass before remembering the strange residue I'd seen swirling in the bottom. Instead, I grabbed my water glass, taking a large gulp that tasted metallic and wrong. Sophie was watching me with the intensity of a hawk eyeing a mouse, her red lips curved in an encouraging smile. "It's really quite standard, Frank. Just a signature here and there. We could have it all wrapped up tonight, and then you'd never have to worry about these things again." The papers rustled as Ethan turned the pages, and I caught glimpses of legal terms that made my head spin. Transfer of assets, irrevocable trust, full financial authority. The kitchen door swung open with a soft whoosh, and a small woman in a black uniform appeared carrying a silver tray laden with what looked like tiny works of art. The pastries were arranged in perfect rows, each one garnished with a delicate sugar flower or a drizzle of chocolate that caught the candlelight. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being invisible, her steps silent on the marble floor. I'd been so focused on Ethan and Sophie that I hadn't even realized there was household staff. "Maria makes the most incredible desserts," Sophie said, her voice bright with artificial enthusiasm. "She's been with us since we moved in. An absolute treasure." Maria approached my chair first, extending the tray with both hands. As I reached for one of the pastries, her shoulder brushed against mine, and I felt her fingers press gently against my arm through the fabric of my jacket. The touch lasted only a second, but something about it felt deliberate, urgent. When I looked up at her face, she was staring straight ahead, her expression neutral, but her dark eyes flicked sideways toward the kitchen door so quickly, I almost missed it. Then she moved on to serve Sophie, her movements once again smooth and professional, as if nothing had happened. "These look incredible," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I bit into what tasted like lemon and butter and something else I couldn't identify. Maria nodded politely, but as she leaned over to serve Ethan, I caught her reflection in the silver tray. Her eyes found mine in the distorted surface, and she gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. So subtle that if I hadn't been watching for it, I would have missed it entirely. My stomach clenched, and suddenly the pastry turned to sawdust in my mouth. Dinner continued with an air of forced normalcy, Sophie chatting about their recent vacation to Tuscany, while Ethan occasionally tapped the manila folder with his index finger, as if reminding me of its presence. I managed to push food around my plate and make appropriate responses, but all my attention was focused on Maria as she cleared dishes and refilled water glasses. Each time she passed behind my chair, I felt that same gentle, deliberate brush of contact. When she finally announced that coffee would be served in the living room, I saw my chance. "Actually," I said, pushing back from the table, "I think I'll stretch my legs for a moment. That was such a wonderful meal. I'm afraid I overate." Sophie's smile flickered for just an instant, like a candle in a breeze. "Of course, Frank. The powder room is just down the hall if you need it." But instead of heading toward the hallway, I followed the soft sound of running water toward what I assumed was the kitchen. Behind me, I heard Ethan's voice, low and urgent, though I couldn't make out the words. Sophie's laugh followed, but it sounded strained, like a violin string pulled too tight. The kitchen was a masterpiece of stainless steel and white marble, with professional-grade appliances that probably cost more than my entire house. Maria stood at the sink, her back to the doorway, washing crystal glasses with careful precision. When she heard my footsteps, she turned, and I saw fear written across her features as clearly as if it had been painted there. "Senor?" she whispered, glancing nervously toward the dining room. "You should not be here." But her tone suggested she was glad I was. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to match hers. "Those messages," I said. "Are they from you?" She nodded once, quickly, her hands still moving automatically to dry the glass she held. "They planned this," she said, her English accented but clear. "I hear them talking this afternoon. Powder in the drink. Make you confused, make you sign." My blood turned to ice as her words confirmed my worst fears. "Papers upstairs in the office. They show me yesterday, tell me to dust around them. Transfer everything. Your house, your money, everything." Her voice trembled like a leaf in the wind, and I could see the courage it was taking for her to tell me this. "Don't trust them, senor. Please. They think you are alone, think nobody will help you, but I see how they look at each other when you're not watching. Like," she searched for the right word, her brow furrowed with concentration. "Like wolves." Maria's eyes darted toward the dining room, where I could hear Sophie's laughter mixing with the clink of silverware against china. "Come," she whispered, drying her hands on her apron with quick, nervous movements. "I show you, but we must be very quiet." She moved toward a narrow hallway I hadn't noticed before, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floor. I followed, my dress shoes seeming to thunder with each step, though I tried to walk on my toes like a man half my age sneaking past sleeping parents. The hallway was lined with family photographs in expensive frames, Ethan and Sophie at various exotic locations, their smiles bright and practiced. At the end of the corridor, Maria stopped at a heavy wooden door and pressed her ear against it, listening. After a moment, she turned the brass handle with infinite care, and the door swung open to reveal what was clearly Ethan's home office. The room smelled of leather and expensive cologne, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive mahogany desk that dominated the space like a throne. Maria pointed toward the desk with a trembling finger. One of the drawers was slightly ajar, as if someone had closed it hastily without checking if it had latched properly. "There," she breathed, so quietly I had to lean close to hear her. "I was dusting this afternoon, saw them putting papers inside, talking in Spanish, thinking I don't understand English good enough." Her accent thickened with her nervousness, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made my chest tighten with gratitude and dread. I approached the desk like a man walking through a minefield, each step measured and careful. The drawer slid open with the whisper-soft sound of well-oiled wood on wood, revealing a neat stack of legal documents. My hands shook as I lifted the first sheet, and the words seemed to blur before my eyes. Power of Attorney, Frank Miller. Below that, property transfer agreements with my address typed in neat legal font, bank authorization forms, and at the bottom of the stack, something that made my blood freeze. Collection notices from what looked like a loan shark operation, all addressed to Ethan Miller, all with amounts that had more zeros than my pension had seen in a lifetime. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to reach for it, muscle memory taking over where my shocked brain couldn't function. The camera flash seemed blindingly bright in the dim office, and I winced, expecting alarms to sound or footsteps to come running. But there was only the distant sound of Sophie's voice from the dining room, talking about their wine collection. I photographed every document, every signature line, every damning piece of evidence that painted a picture I'd never wanted to see. My son, the successful businessman, was drowning in debt and had apparently decided that his father's life savings were the perfect life preserver. Maria watched me work, her hands twisted together in front of her apron, her eyes flicking between me and the doorway like a sparrow watching for cats. When I finished photographing the documents, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out something small and black, a USB drive that looked no bigger than my thumbnail. "This too," she whispered, pressing it into my palm. The plastic felt warm from her body heat, and I could feel her hand trembling as it touched mine. "Their computer password is Sophie's birthday, 061892. I see him type many times." "What's on it?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Maria's face crumpled with what looked like shame mixed with determination. "Emails, bank transfers. I work for family before. They fire me when husband gets sick. No severance, nothing. But I learn computers from their son." Her voice grew stronger, more defiant. "So when Senor Ethan leave laptop open, I copy files. Insurance, you understand? In case they try to blame me for something." She paused, swallowing hard. "But this is bigger than I think. Much bigger." I slipped the USB into my vest pocket, next to Laura's watch, feeling like I was carrying dynamite next to my heart. The tiny device seemed to burn against my chest, its weight far heavier than its size should have allowed. "Maria," I started, but she held up her hand, cutting me off. From the dining room came the sound of chairs scraping against the floor and Sophie's voice calling out with honey-sweet concern. "Frank, are you feeling all right? You've been gone quite a while." "Go," Maria hissed, pushing me gently toward the door. "Act normal. I bring coffee to living room in 5 minutes. You sit, you smile, you don't sign nothing." Her dark eyes burned with an intensity that reminded me of my mother when she was protecting her family from neighborhood bullies. "I text you when safe to leave. You understand?" I nodded, though my legs felt like jelly, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to clench them into fists to stop the trembling. As I walked back through the hallway, past the smiling photographs of my son and daughter-in-law in their expensive vacations, I felt like I was moving through a dream. The same faces that had seemed so happy and successful 20 minutes ago now looked predatory, calculating. Sophie's perfect smile seemed to hide shark teeth. Ethan's confident pose looked like the stance of a man who had convinced himself that stealing from his own father was somehow justified, somehow noble. I slipped back into the dining room just as Sophie was gathering the dessert plates with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to entertaining. "There you are!" she exclaimed, her voice bright enough to power the chandelier above us. "I was starting to worry that our cooking had made you ill." Her laugh tinkled like wind chimes, but I caught the way her eyes scanned my face, searching for something. Guilt, knowledge, suspicion. I forced my lips into what I hoped was a reassuring smile and settled back into my chair, trying to look like a man who had simply needed a moment to digest a large meal. Ethan was leaning back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass with lazy confidence, but I noticed the manila folder was still positioned exactly where he'd left it, like a spider waiting patiently in the center of its web. "Feeling better, Dad?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. "You looked a little pale there for a minute." I nodded, reaching for my water glass with hands I willed to be steady. Just needed to splash some cold water on my face. That was quite a meal. My phone buzzed against my chest, and this time I didn't jump. The sensation was almost welcome now, like hearing from a trusted friend. Under the table, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen, angling it so neither Sophie nor Ethan could see the display. The message was short and urgent. "Save evidence. Delay signing. Police already alerted. Police. The word hit me like a physical blow, and I had to take a sip of water to keep from gasping out loud. Someone had called the police. Someone was taking this seriously enough to involve law enforcement. I looked up to find both Ethan and Sophie watching me expectantly, their faces masks of concern and patience. The manila folder sat between us like a loaded gun, its yellow tabs catching the candlelight like tiny flames. "So," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "that dessert Maria brought looked absolutely incredible. Is she making coffee to go with it?" Sophie's smile brightened, but there was something sharp lurking behind it, something that made me think of broken glass hidden in silk. "Of course, Frank, but perhaps we could finish our little discussion first. About those papers." The air in the room felt thick and charged, like the moment before lightning strikes, and I realized that whatever game we'd been playing all evening was about to reach its climax. The next hour crawled by like torture, every minute stretched thin as wire, while I sat at that beautiful table making small talk about the weather and Sophie's garden. My coffee cup rattled against its saucer each time I set it down, betraying the tremors in my hands that I couldn't quite control. The USB drive felt like a burning coal pressed against my chest, and every time Sophie's laugh rang out, it sounded like breaking glass in my ears. Ethan kept glancing at his watch, then at the manila folder, his fingers drumming that same nervous rhythm against the white tablecloth. Finally, when I couldn't stand another second of their performance, I pushed back from the table and stood on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. "This has been wonderful," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "But I should probably head home. It's getting late, and I'm not the night owl I used to be." Sophie's face fell in what looked like genuine disappointment, but her eyes held something calculating that made my skin crawl. "Oh, but Frank, we haven't finished our discussion about those papers. It would only take a few minutes." "Another time," I said firmly, extending my hand toward Ethan. "We have plenty of time to talk about the future." My son's handshake felt different now. His palm was damp with perspiration, and his grip was too tight, too desperate, like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. His smile stretched across his face like plastic wrap, and I could see tiny beads of sweat forming at his hairline despite the cool evening air. "Thanks, son," I managed, the word son tasting like ashes in my mouth. "We'll talk soon." The lie came easier than I'd expected, rolling off my tongue smooth as honey. Sophie walked me to the door, her red silk dress rustling with each step, her perfume creating a cloud around us that made my nose burn. "Drive safely, Frank," she said, kissing my cheek with lips that felt cold as marble. "And do think about what we discussed tonight. It really would be for the best." Her fingers lingered on my arm longer than necessary, and I felt like a mouse being petted by a cat that was deciding whether to play with it or eat it immediately. As I walked to my Honda, the mansion's windows glowed behind me like a stage set, beautiful and artificial. I could feel their eyes watching me through the glass, tracking my movements as I fumbled with my car keys with fingers that wouldn't quite work properly. The engine turned over with a reliable rumble that sounded like freedom, and I backed out of that circular driveway faster than I should have, gravel crunching under my tires like broken bones. In my rearview mirror, I saw the front door still standing open, two silhouettes framed in the golden light, watching until my taillights disappeared around the corner. The drive back to Queens felt like traveling through a different world, leaving the manicured lawns and mansion facades of Montclair for the familiar sight of row houses and corner bodegas. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, and every red light felt like an eternity where my mind could race through everything I'd discovered. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, The small house that had felt so empty and quiet for the past 2 years looked like a sanctuary. Its modest brick facade and Laura's flower boxes by the window more beautiful than all of Ethan's marble and crystal. Inside, I went straight to the kitchen drawer where I kept important phone numbers written on index cards in Laura's careful handwriting. My fingers walked through the familiar names until I found the one I needed. Harris, lawyer, with a phone number that I'd called only twice in 30 years, both times for simple estate planning. Arthur Harris had been Laura's friend first, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd handled our wills and the mortgage paperwork with patient thoroughness. At 10:30 on a Thursday night, I had no right to expect him to answer, but desperation made me dial anyway. "Frank?" His voice came through groggy but alert, and I realized I'd probably woken him up. "Is everything all right? It's pretty late for a social call." I took a shaky breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered like leaves in a windstorm. "Arthur, I need your help. Something's happened with Ethan. Something bad." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped, but then I heard him moving around, probably reaching for his glasses and a pen. "Tell me everything," he said, and his voice had shifted into the professional tone I remembered from our previous meetings. So I did. I told him about the dinner invitation, the strange text messages, the papers hidden in Ethan's desk, Maria's revelations about debt and loan sharks. My voice cracked when I described the power of attorney documents with my name already typed in, waiting only for my signature to sign my life away. "I took pictures," I said, pulling out my phone with hands that still trembled. "And there's a USB drive with more evidence. I can send you everything right now." The photos uploaded slowly, each one a small dagger of betrayal, as I watched them transfer to Harris's email. The USB contents took longer, file after file of documents that painted a picture of financial desperation and calculated fraud. When it was finished, Harris was quiet for so long, I thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, his voice came through the speaker, heavy with something that sounded like sadness mixed with professional anger. "Frank," he said quietly, "you just saved yourself from losing everything." I was sitting in Laura's chair, holding her photograph and trying to process everything that had happened, when my phone rang at 11:47. The sudden sound in the quiet house made me jump so hard I nearly dropped the picture, and my heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the caller ID. Ethan. His name glowed on the screen like an accusation, and for a moment I considered not answering. But curiosity won out over caution, and I swiped to accept the call. "Dad?" His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, stripped of the confident businessman persona he'd worn all evening. There was something raw and desperate in it that made my chest tighten with unwanted sympathy. "Dad, please, we need to talk." I could hear traffic in the background, as if he was calling from his car, and there was a tremor in his voice that reminded me of the little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys. "I'm listening," I said, my voice colder than I'd intended. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we weren't saying, all the trust that had been broken in the space of a single evening. When he finally spoke again, his words came out in a rush like water through a broken dam. "Dad, don't do whatever you're planning to do, please. You don't understand the situation. You don't know what kind of trouble we're in." "I understand enough," I replied, and my voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger, hard and unforgiving. "I understand that you invited me to dinner planning to drug me and steal everything I've worked for my entire life. I understand that you chose greed over family." The words tasted bitter in my mouth, but they needed to be said. "No, Dad, it's not like that." His voice cracked, and I could hear him crying now, the sound coming through the phone like broken glass. I had no choice. The loan sharks. They said they'd hurt Sophie if I didn't come up with the money. They gave me a deadline and I panicked. I thought if I could just borrow against your assets temporarily, just until I could figure something else out. The line went dead. In the sudden silence of my empty house, I sat holding the phone, staring at Laura's picture, wondering how the sweet boy who'd once helped me plant her rose garden had grown into a man capable of such calculated betrayal. Outside, a car drove slowly past my house, its headlights sweeping across my living room walls before disappearing into the night. 3 months later, I sat in the front row of a courtroom that smelled like old wood, my hands folded in my lap to stop them from shaking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the hard wooden bench beneath me felt like it had been designed to make people uncomfortable. Harris sat beside me, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the harsh light as he organized papers in a manila folder that looked nothing like the one Ethan had tried to get me to sign that terrible night. When they brought Ethan in, I barely recognized him. The confident businessman who'd welcomed me into his mansion was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger in a wrinkled gray suit that hung loose on his diminished frame. His hair, once perfectly styled, now fell across his forehead in greasy strands, and his hands shook as he sat down at the defendant's table. The orange jumpsuit underneath his jacket was visible at his collar, a splash of institutional color that made my chest tighten with unwanted sympathy. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman with steel gray hair, stood before the jury like a teacher addressing unruly students. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that the defendant, aided by his wife Sophie Miller, conspired to defraud his own father through drugging and coercion. Her voice cut through the courtroom's silence like a blade, and I watched the jurors' faces as they absorbed her words. Some looked disgusted, others merely tired, as if they'd heard too many stories of family betrayal to be shocked anymore. When Maria took the witness stand, she looked smaller than I remembered, her dark dress making her seem to disappear into the wooden chair. But when she began to speak, her voice was steady and clear. "I see Senora Sophie in the kitchen," she said, her accent thickening with nervousness, but her words precise. "She take small packet, white powder, pour in wine glass. When I ask what she doing, she say is medicine for Senor Frank's heart." The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. "And what did you hear the defendant say about this plan?" the prosecutor asked. Maria's hands twisted in her lap, but her eyes found mine across the courtroom, drawing strength from some invisible connection. "I hear him on phone in office. He say, if he won't sign tonight, we make him sign. The stuff will make him confused, grateful. He won't remember clearly tomorrow." Her words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disgust that spread across the jury box. Ethan's lawyer, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his tie, tried to poke holes in Maria's testimony, suggesting she'd misunderstood, that her English wasn't good enough to know what she'd really heard. But Maria sat straighter with each question, her dignity intact despite his attempts to diminish her. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, she walked past Ethan's table without looking at him. But I saw him flinch, as if she'd struck him. Sophie took the stand wearing a simple blue dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the woman in red silk who'd welcomed me into her home. Her dark hair was pulled back in a modest bun, and she'd traded her diamond earrings for small pearl studs that caught no light. When she raised her right hand to swear to tell the truth, I noticed her wedding ring was gone, leaving a pale band of skin on her finger, like a scar. "Mrs. Miller," the prosecutor began, "you've entered into a plea agreement with the state. Can you tell the court about the events of October 15th? Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper at first, so quiet the judge had to ask her to speak up. When she did, her words hit the courtroom like a bomb. "It was Ethan's idea," she said, and I watched my son's face crumble like a building in an earthquake. He owed money to some very dangerous people. A lot of money. Her testimony unfolded like a horror movie I couldn't look away from. She described Ethan's gambling addiction, his desperate attempts to hide mounting debts from loan sharks who'd grown tired of waiting for payment. "They said they would hurt me if he didn't come up with $200,000 by Halloween," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Ethan said his father had assets, property, savings. He said we could get power of attorney, use the money temporarily, pay it back when his next bonus came through." "And the substance you put in Mr. Miller's wine," the prosecutor pressed. Sophie's hands trembled as she answered. "Ethan got it from someone he knew. He said it would just make Frank confused, compliant. He said old people got confused all the time, that no one would think it was strange." The words hung in the air like poison gas, and I felt physically sick listening to them discuss my mental capacity like I was livestock being prepared for slaughter. When Ethan's lawyer tried to cross-examine her, suggesting she was lying to save herself, Sophie's composure finally cracked. "You want to know the truth?" she screamed, turning to point at Ethan with a shaking finger. "He said if I didn't help him, he'd tell them it was all my idea. He said they'd believe him over me because I was just the wife." Ethan shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. "You lying bitch!" he roared, his face purple with rage. "It was your idea to use the drug! You said he'd never know!" The bailiff moved toward Ethan, handcuffs already in his hand. But my son was beyond caring about courtroom decorum. The mask of respectability he'd worn his entire adult life had finally shattered, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. After the jury delivered their guilty verdict on both conspiracy and attempted elder fraud charges, the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I stood slowly, my knees creaking like old door hinges, and walked to the lectern that faced my son across a divide that felt wider than the Grand Canyon. Ethan looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. "Your Honor," I began, my voice sounding strange in the formal silence of the courtroom. 32 years ago, I held my son in the delivery room and promised him I would always be there to protect him, to guide him, to love him no matter what mistakes he made. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to continue. I kept that promise through scraped knees and broken hearts, through college struggles and career disappointments. I thought he understood that family meant something sacred. Ethan was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he mouthed the word sorry over and over. But I couldn't let myself be moved by his remorse, not after what I'd learned about the depth of his betrayal. "The man who planned to drug me and steal my life savings is not my son," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "My son would have come to me for help. My son would have trusted me with his troubles. My son would never have looked at his father and seen prey." "Dad, please," Ethan called out, his voice breaking. "I'm still your son. I made mistakes, but I'm still your son." The desperation in his voice almost broke my resolve, but I thought of Maria risking her job to protect me, of Harris working through the night to save my assets, of all the people who'd shown me more loyalty than my own flesh and blood. "You stopped being my son the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive," I said, my words falling into the courtroom silence like stones. As the bailiff led him away in shackles, Ethan kept looking back at me over his shoulder, but I didn't meet his eyes. I couldn't. Some betrayals cut too deep to ever heal, even between a father and son. But as I walked out of that courtroom, I caught sight of a familiar figure in the back row, a woman in a dark coat, whose face was partially hidden by shadows, watching the proceedings with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The judge's gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Ethan Miller, my son, was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit elder fraud. I sat in the same front row pew, watching as the bailiff led him away in shackles that clinked with each shuffling step. He didn't look back this time. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when I emerged, their cameras clicking like hungry insects as they thrust microphones toward my face. "Mr. Miller, how does it feel to see justice served? Do you have any regrets about prosecuting your own son? What would you say to other elderly victims?" Their questions buzzed around me like wasps, but Harris guided me through the crowd with the steady hand of someone who'd protected clients from media circuses before. "No comment," he kept repeating, but I could feel their eyes on my back all the way to his car. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page the next morning. "Courageous Father Stops Elder Fraud Scheme." The headline made me wince as I read it over my morning coffee, the same chipped cup Laura used to drink from. Courageous. The word felt too heavy for what I'd done, too grand for a man who'd simply refused to let his son steal his life away. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to in years began stopping by with casseroles and kind words, calling me brave, calling me an inspiration. Mrs. Williams from 3 houses down brought homemade soup and patted my hand while tears ran down her weathered cheeks. "You did right thing," she said in her careful English. "Family, no excuse for stealing." The phone calls started coming from television producers, from writers wanting to tell my story, from support groups for elder abuse victims who wanted me to speak at their meetings. Each conversation felt like walking through quicksand, their voices too bright, too eager to turn my family's destruction into entertainment or inspiration. I declined them all, politely but firmly, and eventually the calls stopped coming. The reporters found other stories to chase, other tragedies to transform into headlines, and I was left alone in my quiet house with the weight of what had happened settling around me like dust after a storm. But even in the silence, I couldn't shake the image of that woman in the dark coat from the courtroom. I'd asked Harris about her, described what I'd seen, but he'd shrugged it off as probably just another curious observer drawn by the media coverage. Still, something about her presence nagged at me like a splinter under the skin, a sense that the story wasn't quite finished yet. 2 weeks after the sentencing, I was sitting in my living room reading when the doorbell chimed its familiar 2-note song. Through the peephole, I saw Maria standing on my front porch holding a covered plate, her dark hair pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn to testify. She looked smaller on my doorstep than she had in that grand mansion, more fragile somehow, but her spine was straight and her chin held high with quiet dignity. "I hope you don't mind me coming," she said when I opened the door, her accent making the words musical even as they trembled with nervousness. "I bring you something." The plate in her hands was warm, and when she lifted the aluminum foil, the smell of cinnamon and vanilla wafted up like a blessing. Homemade cookies, each one perfectly golden and shaped like little stars. My throat tightened with unexpected emotion as I invited her inside, watching her take in my modest living room with eyes that missed nothing. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Laura and I had shared 37 years of meals, and Maria poured coffee from my old percolator with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent her life taking care of others. "I lose my job, of course," she said matter-of-factly, stirring sugar into her cup with Laura's silver spoon. "But it's okay. I find new work with nice family in Princeton. They treat me good." She looked up at me then, her dark eyes shining with something that looked like gratitude mixed with sadness. "Why did you help me?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my chest for months finally finding its way out. Maria set down her coffee cup and was quiet for so long I thought she hadn't heard me. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, like a prayer whispered in an empty church. "You looked at me like person, Senor Frank. Not like furniture, not like invisible thing. When I serve dinner, when I clean, you say please, you say thank you. You ask about my family, remember my grandson's birthday." Her words hit me like a physical blow, making me realize how little I'd thought about such simple courtesies, how natural it had seemed to treat her with basic human decency. "Most people, they look through me like glass," she continued, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "But you see me. So when I see them planning to hurt you, I think, Maria, this is good man. Good man deserve protection." Tears burned behind my eyes as I reached across the table to cover her weathered hand with mine, feeling the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. After Maria left, taking her empty plate and my heartfelt thanks with her, I found myself drawn to Laura's chair by the living room window. The afternoon sun slanted through the sheer curtains she'd sewn by hand, casting dancing shadows on the wall where her watercolor paintings still hung in their simple frames. I pulled her pocket watch from my vest, the same one I'd carried to that terrible dinner, and wound it with careful fingers that no longer shook with rage or fear. The ticking filled the quiet room like a heartbeat, steady and sure, marking time that belonged to me alone now. No one was scheming to take my house, my savings, my dignity. No one was planning to drug my wine or forge my signature on documents that would sign my life away. The freedom felt strange after months of looking over my shoulder, of jumping at unexpected phone calls, of wondering who I could trust. But here in this chair, where Laura used to read her mystery novels, surrounded by the life we'd built together brick by careful brick, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. I thought about Ethan in his prison cell, probably lying on a narrow bunk staring at a concrete ceiling, and waited for the pain to hit. But instead of the sharp agony I'd expected, there was only a dull ache, like the phantom pain from an amputated limb. He'd made his choices, just as I'd made mine. The boy who'd helped me plant roses in Laura's memory was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd been willing to destroy his father to save himself. That was a grief I'd have to carry, but it was clean grief, honest grief, not the poisonous mixture of love and betrayal that had been eating me alive. The pocket watch ticked on, marking moments that were mine to spend as I chose. Tomorrow I might call the senior center about volunteering, or visit the library to find a new book, or simply sit here listening to the sound of my own breathing in this house that no one could take from me. I'd preserved more than my money and property. I'd preserved my dignity, my sense of right and wrong, my ability to trust the Marias of the world who still believed that kindness mattered. Outside my window, Laura's rose bushes were preparing for winter, their branches bare but strong, ready to bloom again when spring returned. If this story reminded you that your dignity is worth fighting for, share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in their battles.